Hello and welcome to the Peak Prosperity Podcast. I'm Adam Taggart. I'll be your host today. I'm the co-founder of Peak Prosperity along with my partner, Chris Martenson. We've been covering the coronavirus now for a little over a month since it initially burst into the scene in Wuhan, China. Many of you listening have probably heard the daily video updates that Chris has been giving online. I'm filling in Chris's shoes today because he is working on the next video that we'll be getting live early tomorrow. With me here is James Wesley Rawles. Jim is a former U.S. Army intelligence officer, and he's the proprietor of survivalblog.com, which is a comprehensive online resource and community for folks interested in preparing for nearly any kind of disaster or emergency. Jim's also the author of several books, including the Patriot novel series and the book Rawles on Retreats and Relocation, which, while now out of print, is an exhaustive survey of which regions in the U.S. are best and worst suited for riding out various different forms of crises. So given Jim's extensive expertise in survival and disaster preparation, we've asked him to come on the podcast today to help us address the top question that Chris and I are hearing from, well, everybody right now. And that is, what do I need to do to keep myself and my family safe from the coronavirus? Jim, thanks so much for being willing to join us on such short notice.
Thanks for having me on, Adam.
You're welcome. Total pleasure. Big fan of your work. We've had you on the podcast before in past years, but we have a lot of new people who are listening to us now who I think have joined us with the coronavirus coverage. So before we get into the details here, can you just give folks a quick summary of your background and the practical expertise that it's helped you develop around preparation?
Sure. I served for 6 years as an Army intelligence officer, primarily in signals intelligence. But one of my secondary skill sets was in nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. I attended the U.S. Army NBC school, and I was an NBC defense officer for one of my units. And I've had a pretty strong interest in preparedness that dates back all the way to my teenage years. I've came from a pioneer family, and also grew up in Livermore, California, which is the home of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. And most of my childhood friends were the children of nuclear physicists, some of whom developed nuclear weapons. My own father was in experimental physics with particle accelerators. And growing up in Livermore gave me a really strong appreciation for what a fragile world we live in and the effects of nuclear weapons. And in fact, Livermore, even to this day, has more privately owned fallout and blast shelters than any other community in the United States.
I did not know that, and I don't live all that far from Livermore.
Well, they're still there. Most of them were built in the early 1960s. A lot of them have sadly been converted into rumpus rooms, but I think that mentality that I grew up with really never wore off, and that was one of the inspirations for starting Survival Blog.
Great. And could you just give a real quick overview of the mission behind Survival Blog and the types of information that you publish on the site there?
Sure. Well, I designed Survival Blog to be kind of the go-to resource for family preparedness. So everything from food storage to water filtration, bug out bags, retreat security, communications, night vision equipment, advanced first aid and medical topics. Pretty much everything you'd want to know about preparedness is there in the archives of Survival Blog. All those archives are available free. They date back all the way to 2005. There's over 30,000 archived articles and columns covering just a panoply of topics, and with far more knowledge than I have personally. I really depend on the brain trust of my readership. I have a little over 100,000 regular readers, and the amount of knowledge and expertise that's out there is just tremendous. And people have been quite willing to share that knowledge. And again, it's all ended up in the archives of Survival Blog.
Great. And a lot of the folks listening here who are longtime Peak Prosperity listeners, they know how we have a similar dynamic at peakprosperity.com where the community itself is the brain trust, to borrow your term there, and is cataloging a lot of their collective knowledge, in forum posts and in the user comments on the site and whatnot in the articles. And I've been to Survival Blog. I've read it for a number of years. Very much agree. It is a incredibly rich wealth of information on really any topic that you could think of relating to preparing for anything, like you said, anything from a short-term power outage to a nuclear blast to a global pandemic, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So, Jim, for someone who has been writing about this and speaking publicly, presenting on this for years, decades, I believe. Even on a subject as specific as what to do in a pandemic. What is your assessment of the coronavirus outbreak, and what are you talking with your community about it? Short story, how seriously should we be taking this from your perspective?
I think we should take it very seriously, but presently more from the potential economic fallout rather than the public health crisis, although that I think will probably be upon us within weeks. It's pretty clear that this virus is transmissible before people are showing visible symptoms. And there's even talk that it might even be transmissible from people who don't even realize they're carrying it.
Right.
So odds are it's going to end up being literally global. It'll be a true global pandemic. And although it's likely to subside a bit in spring and summer, I think it'll come back with a vengeance in the northern hemisphere this coming fall and winter. And while we're experiencing summer, the southern hemisphere, of course, is going to be in winter. They'll have their cold and flu season. And I think the southern hemisphere may actually bear the brunt of this starting in 2 or 3 months.
Okay, well, that comports very closely to what Chris and I have been looking at. If you look at the data right now, it's 95+% of cases have been in the northern hemisphere, and very few so far have been in the southern hemisphere. And part of that might be due to underreporting and a lot of countries there, developing countries that maybe aren't doing a good job at testing. But I think it's hard not to conclude that there is a big seasonality factor to it, that the virus just prefers colder weather, colder, drier weather. And like previous epidemics and pandemics, they do last for months and sometimes years, and during that period they're evolving into another. They're mutating into another phase. So these viruses come in waves. I believe in the Spanish influenza of 1918, 1919, it was the second wave that was actually the really virulent one. So as you just said, that could easily happen where the virus might subside a bit as the northern hemisphere begins to go into spring and summer, but it heads into the southern hemisphere, infects a bunch of people, continues to evolve, and then, as you said, it can jump the equator again as we go back into wintertime. And who knows, that could be a strain that we're just completely unprepared for. Not trying to scare people, but just saying that it certainly has happened before.
Right. And I think your listeners should be made aware the general tendency of viruses is to mutate into less virulent and less deadly strains. That's the general trend, simply because if a virus is too virulent, it kills off its hosts too quickly and doesn't have a chance to propagate. But in the case of the Spanish flu of 1918, I think that's a really good example you brought up. In the first wave, it was killing a lot of older people. In the second wave, it was killing a lot of younger people. In that instance, what happened was they had what's called a cytokine storm response, where their body's own immune systems overreacted to the virus. And there's been a lot of talk in the comment section of my blog about being prepared for this. And a lot of people were saying, oh, you really need to go real heavy on colloidal silver, and you need to have elderberry extract on hand. And there's some folks there who are very quick to point out, hang on a second, folks, you don't want to artificially raise your immune response until we wait and see if there's the risk of a cytokine storm.
Right, right. And just to sort of explain a little bit in more layman's terms, the reason why the Spanish flu in that second wave, it was the younger people or the people in the prime of their lives who were hit harder, is essentially, sort of as you were saying, the virus turns your immune system against you in many ways. And so it was the people with the stronger immune systems who suffered the most in that second wave. So, Jim, we could talk about the science all day long, and I would love to. And as germane here, let's continue to do so. But Chris is doing that on a daily basis on our side.
Let's get practical prepping.
Well, exactly. That's what I wanted to get you on here, because I think people are really hungry for some additional guidance on that part, which is okay. I'll believe what you tell me on the science. Just tell me what I need to do, right? So as I think about it, and you correct me if this framework's incorrect, you sort of approach this as a three-pronged strategy. First, it's look, don't come into contact with the virus if you can, right? The best way not to get infected by it is just to not come near it, right? So that's where self-isolation, social distancing, that type of stuff comes into play. The second is, okay, if I get near it, don't get it on me or in me, right? And this is where we talk about, masks and gloves and dressing gowns and other things, sterilizers and hand sanitizers and stuff like that. And then the third is, okay, if it gets in me, I want to increase my odds of beating it. And in general, you would say this is where I want to have a strong immune system, right? So that if the virus comes in, I can my immune system can rush to the defense and either kill it before it goes systemic, or at least if I get it, I get a mild case versus a harder case. Now, there's some issues there with the cytokine element and whatnot, but I think right now the data is showing it is the older and the more infirm people that are succumbing to it, in terms of getting the serious cases or the high mortality rates. So does that framework of sort of, don't come into contact with it. If you get it on you, make sure you take steps not to get it in you. And then if you get it in you, be as healthy as you can. Is that a good way to look at it?
Absolutely. But there's a lot that goes into all three of those.
Yep.
And in terms of family preparedness for this, people really need to think in terms of hunkering down at home in isolation for a period of not weeks, but months. And there's a lot of logistics that go along with that. For anyone who lives in the country, if you don't have a lock and chain for your front gate, you should buy one, because you want to be able to make sure that no one's going to come onto your property. And if someone does, you don't want to be answering your door. In terms of the logistics for being prepared for that extended period of time, the shortages that we're seeing right now are basically the generally dumb public, the GDP, as I like to call them, really waking up to the basics. Things like N95 masks and gloves and hand sanitizers and maybe nebulizers. And I think the next thing that's going to disappear will probably be oxygen concentrators. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, in a matter of weeks, if this does hit the United States and propagate the way I expect it to, we're going to see shortages of storage food first, and then pretty much all non-perishable foods off the store shelves. And then at the very late stages, people will even be cleaning out the perishable foods to take home to freeze.
Got it. Yeah, and I think we've already begun seeing photos online in China and South Korea, and I think I've even seen some in Iran and Italy of the completely bare store shelves. Right.
Right. And there's already been a report here in the United States that Costco they have a mail order arm, basically, that where you can do an internet order for items for either for pickup or delivery. They've completely sold out of their storage food packages. That's indicative.
Interesting. All right. Well, look, before we get into the details there, you've mentioned a few things that I just, for the people that haven't been perhaps listening and reading, every day for the past month on this, I don't want to skip over for them. So you mentioned masks. You mentioned N95 masks. Just quick description of N95 and what benefit a mask.
An N95 is designed to stop 95% of viruses from reaching your respiratory tract. They're not perfect. If someone has the money and the opportunity, they should go ahead and get a full mil spec, M24 series or better military NBC mask and a lot of spare filter cartridges. But the availability of those, I'm sure, is already pretty low and probably going to be completely depleted soon. Your best bet is to try to find some N95 masks if you haven't already stockpiled them. And as a absolute worst case backup, if you can't find N95 masks, you can at least wear a pair of surgical masks. But surgical masks really aren't designed to stop viruses. So they'll stop some of them, but not as well as an N95 mask.
Yeah.
N95 masks are designed to be disposable. They basically come in two flavors. One is a disposable fiber cup that's held on your nose and mouth area, usually held with rubber bands back behind your ears or over the top of your head, depending on the design. The other type of N95 mask that's commonly available at hardware stores in the construction department is what's called a half face mask, and that's usually has a pair of filter cartridges. Usually they're oblong in shape, and there's a number of different brands on the market. With the half face mask, the advantage is you get a better seal and you have more surface area for the mask filters, so there's less breathing resistance. One thing about all masks, especially military masks, is people who are not accustomed to them tend to get claustrophobic very quickly, and they find themselves lifting the mask with their hands, which is like a major no-no because you're contaminating your own face by doing so. So I like the half face masks simply because they have less breathing resistance, and you can handle some fairly heavy chores while wearing those. And those cartridges, the filter cartridges, are replaceable with new filter discs, although you have to follow a procedure. You can actually find that online at YouTube, for example, for changing filter elements or filter cartridges without contaminating your mask in the process. It actually requires 2 sets of gloves.
Okay.
To do it right.
That's really interesting, because the question I was going to ask you is how long or how many times can you wear these masks before
that's subject to debate. Most of the people who have a lot of experience with them are people who work in contracting, and they say, I've gotten 5 or 6 weeks worth of use out of an N95 mask. Well, that's really well and good if you're dealing with fiberglass or sheetrock dust, not with viruses, because once a mask is contaminated, you really don't have a good way of decontaminating that mask without destroying the filtering capacity of that mask. Because if you're wiping it down with alcohol, you're basically going to clog up that mask and make it ineffective. You also run the risk of contaminating yourself in the process of attempting to decontaminate and reuse a mask. And N95 masks in the medical context are disposable for a reason. Unfortunately, we now live in the age of scarcity for N95 masks, and people are going to have to do their best to kind of fake it. And again, you'll need 2 pairs of gloves. You'll have to, as you come back into your house, in some sort of vestibule area, say your back porch, front porch, or whatever, or maybe even the trunk of a car, you're going to be wearing gloves. You're going to remove your N95 mask, lay it face down. Mouth side down on a table or on the floor of your trunk, and then after you close your trunk, you're going to have to remove those gloves. And then if you're going to try to reuse that mask, you have to very gingerly, wearing a new set of gloves, attempt to handle the mask only by the straps and get it onto your face without contaminating yourself with the exterior, touching your face, especially your eyes, your lips, or the soft mucous membranes of your nose. You don't want to have the exterior of the mask come into contact with anything that'll transmit virus. So it's really a tricky proposition. But again, we are now in the age of absolute scarcity for N95 masks. From a couple of news reports I've read, the Chinese are no longer exporting any masks. They were the source of 98% of the N95 masks on the world market. They've diverted all of those for domestic use. So there will be no more coming into the country, and it'll be months before domestic manufacturers can ramp up to meet domestic demand. So essentially, what you've got is all you've got. And in my blog, we use a lot of acronyms. One of them is YOYO. That stands for You're on Your Own. And unfortunately, what people have in terms of their current supplies of N95 masks, unless they're very lucky finding them on the open market, finding some small town hardware store that still has some tucked away, what you have is essentially your entire supply for at least the first wave of this outbreak.
Okay. Two quick questions, and we'll get on to non-mask related questions. One is, so it sounds like you can perhaps figure out how to replace the little filters in the N95 mask, and for those that are, handy and can find the instructions, they can figure it out. But probably for the vast majority of folks, they're either not that handy or they're not skilled enough that they're probably going to end up maybe infecting themselves in the process of trying to do so, or destroying the filter of the mask. So my question is if you're one of those people and you just don't want to screw around with the filter, is it better to try to reuse an N95 mask, or is it, once you've worn it once in a place where you think that you've been exposed to people that might have it, is it best to just ditch the mask?
Oh boy, that's a really tough question. You're really playing a game of Russian roulette if you do that. So if you have been out and about and you think the chances of exposure to someone who's actually ill are low, then it might be worth the risk to reuse an N95 mask. Otherwise, they only belong one place, and that's in a burn barrel.
Got it. Okay, so now you've either used up your N95 masks, or you're one of those you're on your own people where you just don't have any.
And then you're down to wrapping socks around your face or something.
I mean that's what I was going to say. I mean, obviously the simple solution is just don't go out into public places. But
right, unfortunately, because of people's work situations, family obligations, or just the need to go out and buy food for people who didn't stock up, people are going to be forced to face a very unenviable position, and that is forced to be out in public without proper PPE, which is the protective equipment. I don't envy the people in that situation, but a lot of people, unfortunately, are going to be there.
Yeah, and are there any hacks that are worth talking about? I've seen some things online of kind of jerry rigging. I've
seen some pretty comical photos coming out of China with people using a brassiere cut in half and one of the cups from a brassiere in the place of a mask. I've seen pictures of people with disposable diapers over their face.
And are these all just placebos, or are these better than nothing?
Well, probably better than nothing, because at least the chance of a fairly large spittle drop coming from someone you're talking with reaching your mouth is minimized. The problem is there's also, in addition to the large spittle drops that you can see, there's a fine mist that people give off. And unless the lighting is right, you'd never see that.
Right.
But at least it's better than nothing.
Okay. All right. So, boy, if you can get yourself some N95 masks, get them. If you get them, though, realize that they largely are single use unless you can figure out how to replace the filters and handle them in such a way that you're not contaminating yourself in the process. And then if you have no masks and must go outside, jerry-rigging something is probably better than nothing, but don't expect it to give you too much protection.
Right. And in all cases, do not forget that you all need at least wraparound wraparound like glasses, for example, because you don't want a droplet of spittle to touch your cornea. That's one of the main avenues that viruses get into the human body.
Right, right. So we're not talking about regular glasses or sunglasses here. We're talking about sort of a self-contained wraparound, almost sort of like painters use when they're paint spraying, right?
That would be best, but at least shooting glasses where you have side protection.
Okay.
But standard glasses don't provide that much protection at all, because you could have a droplet of spittle come in from the side.
Okay.
So you at least want wraparound glasses, like wraparound sunglasses or wraparound shooting glasses. But proper goggles, like you'd see in a home workshop, are far, far better.
Right, right. And
those can be reused and be decontaminated. Any glasses or goggles are much, much easier to decontaminate and reuse than a mask. But again, you're going to have to use 2 pair of gloves, and you're going to have a pretty large supply of at least alcohol on hand. Preferably, you're going to be using a bleach solution, and the very best solution is povidone solution, and that's that's actually 2 or 3 chemicals involved, but the main one is iodine in that solution, and you'd be using a light solution of that to rinse your goggles. And then you'd let them air dry and reuse them.
Great. So where would one get povidone?
Well, you can actually still find it on eBay and Amazon, and you probably will be able to find it at your local drugstore. Just ask your druggist for povidone solution, and it's sold under several different brand names, but it has a brownish tint to it, and it's made in very large quantity. So the chances are you'll still be able to find that. And that same solution is what you're going to want to use with, like, for example, you'd start with either a rag or a standard baby wipe, dip that in povidone solution, and that's what you're going to be wiping down your front doorknob with, for example, or telephone handsets, or God forbid you have to go to the store after it hits, but shopping cart handles.
Got it. So in addition to maybe bringing, hand sanitizer with you wherever you go, bring a container of povidone to wipe down public surfaces.
Correct.
Got it. Okay. So in terms of sort of a shopping list, then we've got masks if we can get them. We've got the wraparound glasses. We've got, everybody should just go get some bottles of Clorox because it's super cheap and you can distill it and use it as your backup. But go get some povidone if you can get that. Let's talk about gloves for a second because you mentioned them a number of times.
One other piece of equipment that most people overlook, and that's booties. You can find those in drugstores still, or they're widely available again on Amazon or eBay. But disposable booties like those that are used in surgical suites or in electronics clean rooms, because you don't want to be tracking virus into your house. And so just before you're going to remove your gloves as you come into the house, the first thing you're going to do is remove your plastic booties, throw those into the burn barrel. Then you're going to remove the gloves carefully, not to contaminate yourself. And then the gloves go in the burn barrel. And someone inside the house is going to open the door for you. You're not going to touch the outer doorknob.
Got it. And you're talking about these booties as they're sort of like galoshes. You put them on before you go out. They're
lightweight plastic. They have a little elastic strap to go around your ankle, and they're designed for one-time use. Now, if you run out of those or you can't find them, you can simply use Ziploc bags and rubber bands.
Huh. Okay. That's sort of the poor man's booty, huh?
Yeah, quart size Ziploc work pretty well unless you have really big feet or you're wearing boots.
Okay. All right. So I want to talk about gloves, and
Or sorry,
then
I'm sorry. Did I say quart size? I meant to say gallon size. Gallon size.
okay, yeah, maybe for kids they can wear quart size.
Yeah.
Kids. Um, all right. So let's talk real quickly about gloves, and then the question I want to ask you is. At what point do you start adopting these behaviors? I mean, we're talking about, you leave the house, you're wiping everything down,
I,
you've got your boots on and stuff like that. Or should
I
everybody
would say,
right?
Adam, to be safe, at the first report of a confirmed case in your county
Okay.
is when you should start adopting that.
All right. That's a
Uh,
great red line to have.
it may be overcautious, but it's I guess it's better to be safe than sorry.
Right. Well, and with this disease, you mentioned earlier on that people can be asymptomatic for such a long period of time. I mean, there are reports of up to like 27 days where the people are contagious, but they feel fine and they don't know it. So of course they're going out about their daily business, but they're shedding the virus everywhere they're going. So by the time that there was a confirmed outbreak in your county, you can probably have confidence that there are dozens to hundreds, if not thousands, of people that may already be infected but not know it.
Right. And on that same day, for any of your listeners who wear beards, that's the day you shave it off. You can keep your mustache, but everything else has to go.
And
You have to have a good seal on flesh. You don't get a good seal with any sort of protective mask if you're up against beard hair.
Got it. So just to be clear, we're back to masks now. So any beard hair, even just sort of a day or two stubble, can compromise the seal, right?
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, gentlemen, time to become clean shaven. All right. Well, quickly, let's get back to gloves because you mentioned them a bunch. We just talking the relatively cheap box of 50, 100 surgical gloves that you can buy at a pharmacy.
Yeah, just regular nitrile gloves, and actually a significant portion of the population is allergic to latex. So if you can, it's better to get nitrile exam gloves rather than latex gloves, just in case someone might have a reaction.
Okay.
And, just regular exam gloves are probably sufficient for most tasks when you're just going to be out and about, going to a bank or going to a store. Heavier gloves for heavier tasks, of course.
Okay. Yeah. If you're
you wear like rubber cleaning gloves, for example, if you have to do anything heavy duty out in public.
Like the big Playtex dishwashing gloves you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so those. Well, let me put it this way: the nitrile gloves or the surgical gloves we were talking about, I assume those are one and done gloves, right? You come back home, you have those
yes,
burn back.
definitely. Yeah, there's just basically no good way to try to decontaminate gloves. They really are designed. Maybe with your heavier gloves, you might try it where you would basically soak the gloves in povidone solution, and then
that was my question.
Hang them up on a clothesline, perhaps. But again, it's going to take another pair of gloves just to handle them to get them into the povidone solution.
Right.
It's problematic.
So basically, get yourself a whole lot of surgical gloves while you can, right?
Yes, absolutely. They're currently widely available, still inexpensive. The price on N95 masks has gone ballistic recently. One of my readers mentioned having seen one disposable N95 mask, which 3 months ago was selling for anywhere from 80 cents to $1.10, selling at $40 on eBay. One mask.
Wow, I'm rich in masks now. Sadly, I won't be putting them on eBay anytime soon. All right, so we've talked a lot about protecting yourself if you have to go out into the wide world. Let's assume for a moment that you are home, you are self-isolating. It is for a prolonged period of time. Right. Hopefully you have enough food stores, but we're going to talk about that in just a moment.
And hopefully all the public utility workers are going to show up, so water still comes magically out of your tap. and your lights magically turn on when you flip the switch.
Yeah.
If those public utility employees don't show up for work, we could be in for a whole cascade of events. And that's one of the things that I've talked about for many, many years in Survival Blog, is that the three U.S. national power grids really are the linchpin of modern society. And if the grids go down, all bets are off, because soon after the grids go down, within 72 hours for most people, that means their water's going to stop flowing as well, because of current EPA standards. There's a pump in every civic water supply, because they usually are running water through giant filters to meet the nephelometer the turbidity standards that are set by the EPA for water clarity. There's no longer gravity-fed systems in probably 98% of American cities.
All right, so I'm gonna just wind you up and set you loose here, Jim. In terms of okay, so somebody is settling down now for an indeterminately long self-quarantine.
Okay.
And to be prepared for, not only feeding their family, but feeding and caring for their family if these public services go down. So I'm sure, I know there's going to be a lot of information, but what are the top things that you think people, just need to go get if they don't have right now?
Well, I guess the absolute top would be a water filter, because the supply of those is incredibly thin. Right now, most water filters are marketed to backpackers and a few preppers. The number of filters out there, we have a nation of 350 million people. There's probably only 1 or 2 million at most water filters, good quality water filters, in the supply chain right now. That's not a lot to go around. So that should be at the very top of people's list, would be a top quality filter that's fine enough to treat water from open sources, so that they won't stop viruses, but they will stop bacteria. And in a public health crisis, the main risk, if we're grid down, will actually be bacterial infections, not viral infections. So even ironically, in the midst of a viral pandemic, a lot of people are going to be dying from bacterial infections. So it's really important that people have a really top quality filter that they can use to treat water from open sources. Here I'm talking about downspout water from off of people's roofs, or pond water, creeks water from streams, or whatever. The brands that I like are like the Sawyer mini filter, for example. Any of the filters made by Katahdin. It looks like it's spelled Katadyn, but it's spoken Katahdin. It's Katadyn. And then for a large filter for your kitchen, I like the big Berkey filters. That's a stainless steel filter made in England by Dalton. In fact, it's the same Dalton company that makes China, because the filters inside are white ceramic. So water filtration should be right at the top of your list. Then you need to think in terms of how you're going to cook if there's no power, or if eventually even the natural gas, piped natural gas, if you're on utility, will stop working. So how you're going to cook, how you're going to source water. You need to think in terms of not just being able to filter water, but how you're going to transport that water. If you have to go to a nearby stream or pond, water weighs 8 pounds a gallon. So how are you going to get that home? You need to think in terms of 5-gallon water cans to carry that water, and perhaps something like a 2-wheeled garden cart so you can carry several cans at once, because it's absolutely exhausting trying to carry a 5-gallon water can any distance whatsoever. So water filtration, food storage, cooking. Then you need to think in terms of lighting, home security, first aid, and then acute care for anyone who's ill or injured. And if it's someone ill with a virus, then you need to have a completely separate structure. You're going to have someone out in a guest cabin or a barn, perhaps, where you can isolate someone who does come down with this so that everyone in the family doesn't. You need to think in terms of security for your family, self-defense, lighting, night vision equipment. The list goes on and on. If your listeners are folks who read websites or blogs like mine, they're probably ahead of the power curve. Some of your listeners may be behind the power curve, and their chances of finding something like night vision equipment while they still have a decent budget are pretty slim. But there's a lot of things that you need to think through. Basically, sit down, make yourself what I call a list of lists. Make a food storage list, a water list, a first aid list, a communications list, a lighting list, a bedding list, a clothing list, a gardening list, and prioritize those lists and just think through logically all the eventualities of having to live with your family in full isolation for a period of months. Again, there are going to be some pretty lengthy lists. And for anyone who's behind the power curve, you're going to have to very carefully prioritize those lists. Yeah. If you go to my website, survivalblog.com, up at the top under resources, if you click on list of lists, I actually have a large list of lists with quite a few details in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's available for free download.
Oh, great. I was going to mention something similar at Peak Prosperity very quickly for new users. peakprosperity.com/WSID. That stands for What Should I Do? We have a What Should I Do guide there. Step 0 is all about emergency preparation, which touches upon a lot of what Jim mentions here with specific product recommendations. But Jim, it sounds like you've already got some existing lists on your site too. And again, that's right off the homepage there.
Yes, it is. Just go look under the resources tab at the top of the main page at survivalblog.com. Another thing under my resources page is I wrote about 8 or 9 years ago a standalone page titled "How to Protect Your Family from an Influenza Pandemic," and that's still available
here.
And it's available again free of charge. And you can get to it right from the resources tab at survivalblog.com.
Fantastic. We'll also link to the general lists in that specific resource from the write-up of this podcast, Jim, so people can get there directly.
Thanks, Adam.
Oh, no worries. Thank you for putting that together. Hey, a question for you on, we are going to have a mix of people listening to this podcast, some of who are in front of the power curve, some of whom are behind. For the people that are not already well stocked up on a lot of the things that you've mentioned, a huge part of getting through a multi-month, crisis like this is going to be your community. Relying on other people to help provide some of the things that you can't provide on your own, and you being in service to them and vice versa. And of course, a pandemic's dicey because you've got to be careful about person-to-person contact. But can you talk a bit about how to leverage social relationships during a time like this?
Well, I've always put a premium at Survival Blog on barter and charity. And I come to it all from a Christian perspective. And my philosophy is to give until it hurts and to be as charitable as possible. And not everyone's going to be in the situation where they'll have anything extra to share, but for those who do, I would ask them to, pray about it, examine their own conscience, and think through what items you have that you can spare to help your neighbors and friends and coworkers, and also think about how you're going to get that into people's hands without compromising yourself. In the context of a viral outbreak, how are you going to get it to them without also bringing home a virus? And even in just a social collapse, say an economic collapse situation, how you would get charity into other people's hands without compromising your physical security, because you don't want to be known as the rich guy with extra stuff. That's the guy who gets his house knocked off. So I often write in my blog about the importance of making contact through local charitable organizations or churches, where you would very quietly approach church elders, let them know that you have some extra things available, and ask that your name would never be mentioned, and then that those charitable items would be distributed through that third party.
Okay, that sounds real prudent, being the anonymous donor to a service organization that can then get the materials to the folks who need them most. I'm going to ask a even more pointed question, which is, hopefully most people listening right now, there has not been a outbreak reported in their county yet. So what questions or topics would you recommend they discuss right now with their neighbors, whether you live in an apartment building, so you're talking to people who live on the floors around you, or whether you live in a neighborhood and you're talking to the houses down the street? What kind of things should people prearrange now before a quarantine comes into play?
Well, for anyone who lives in a suburban environment where some of your neighbors garden and some don't, I think it would be apropos to approach your neighbors and let them know what sort of produce that you have available to trade. And I think bartering will become very important, because people literally, even if there's still food on the shelves, are not going to want to go to stores, but they might feel more comfortable bartering across their back fence. So it's appropriate to talk with your neighbors, ask them if they've stocked up. If they haven't, urge them in no uncertain terms. Tell them, I'm stocking up. I expect you to stock up. If you don't stock up, don't come looking to me for charity, because I won't have that much extra. Please, please stock up to the best of your ability. I don't recommend that people go out and max out their credit cards, but while supplies are available, this is the appropriate time to stock up on beans, bullets, and Band-Aids. And to the best of your ability, you should stock up, and the extra that you have on hand will be appropriate for both barter and charity. So do talk to your neighbors, encourage them to stock up as best they can, and if possible, in just the last few days or weeks available before this thing goes like wildfire across the United States, as I'm expecting, people should think in terms of getting together for group purchases, where saying to your neighbor, say you have an elderly neighbor, I'm going to be going to Costco. Can I help you stock up? You want me to pick up a few things for you? Let me know what you want. You can reimburse me. That sort of thing. So buying in quantity always makes sense. And it's just a matter of having the appropriate containers to divide things for barter or charity. And extra containers are one of the things that you want to have on hand. Say that you have if you're fortunate enough to have a 500-gallon underground fuel tank, how are you going to get fuel into the hands of people for barter without letting them know that you have a 500-gallon tank? You're going to have a whole bunch of empty 1 or 2-gallon cans. So you got to think all those things through. Getting back to discussions with neighbors, you need to talk about talk through with your neighbors. Find out who might have a nebulizer. Find out who might have a extra oxygen concentrator, for example.
Yep.
A lot of families.
I'm trying to interrupt you here, Jim, but can you just very quickly describe what each one of those things is? I'm not sure everyone listening knows what those two things are. A
nebulizer is basically a steamer that is designed. You basically put your face directly above, or often they're set up with a face type mask where steam is going to be brought up from this machine as it warms up, and you get to breathe it in either through your mouth or your nose. And you can actually, with a nebulizer, infuse that with something like colloidal silver. So they're very practical.
Which has lots of antibacterial.
Difficulty breathing, a nebulizer can literally be a lifesaver, but it's only a $20 item. The next step up, of course, is an oxygen concentrator for anyone with a chronic breathing condition, whether it's emphysema, COPD, which is a chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. Anybody with a chronic problem like that will probably either be on bottled oxygen or these days, more likely, an oxygen concentrator, which is, they make them two different styles. An AC unit that plugs into a wall outlet, and they're really a marvel of modern technology. It's a machine that sits there with a little compressor, and very quietly takes ambient, regular air from your room and concentrates oxygen, puts it into a tube, and that's run to a cannula or a face mask to go on someone's mouth, and it's just like medical oxygen they would have at a hospital.
All right, and one of the reasons why.
And then they also make portable oxygen concentrators, which are run off of batteries, but of course the batteries have to be recharged. What I recommend people find is a floor model oxygen concentrator, such as the ones, let's see, I'm trying to think of some name brands here. There's like the Everflow, for example, is one of the main ones on the market. You can find those used currently on Craigslist for around $175 to $300. If you have just one of those in your extended family, and someone in your family comes down with a life-threatening illness that causes pneumonia, it can literally be the difference between life and death.
Okay, great. And that's what I wanted to underscore here. The reason why that's so particularly relevant to this coronavirus outbreak is that the serious complications generally get pneumonia.
Because, let's face it, there's only 900,000 hospital beds in the United States. Of those, I would say, maybe 75% of them are for acute patients. That's for a population of 350 million people. What happens when we go from past 900,000 to 2 million, 3 million people infected and with symptoms severe enough to send them to the hospital? There simply will not be enough hospital beds available. So home health care is going to be folks' only option. And unless they have something like a nebulizer or preferably if they can afford it and find it, an oxygen concentrator, you're basically just going to watch your relatives' lungs fill up and watch them die.
And just to put some numbers behind that, we're dealing with the official numbers. Most of them reported by China. So, we really don't know how much we can trust the numbers right now. We know we're working with imperfect data, but given the numbers we have, it looks like the complication rate is around 15%. Okay. So let's say, 100 million people in America get infected. That's 15 million serious complications. And you said, that there's only 900,000 hospital beds. That's,
right.
Something like.
And even worse than that, for the people who have severe complications, they're going to need more than just medical oxygen. They're actually going to need a hospital respirator. They're either going to need to be intubated, or they're going to need to be on what used to be called an iron lung, which is a hospital respirator.
There are how many in the country? Not very many.
There's very few of those out there. Most hospitals only have one or two of them. And if we have a public health crisis with a 15% complication rate, and a good number of those patients require more than medical oxygen, we're going to see some pretty high morbidity.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jim, we're going to begin to enter lightning round here only because I'm looking at the time and realizing I could go on for another 2 hours with you, and I don't think we would have gotten halfway through the questions I'd like to ask.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I want to acknowledge I interrupted you for those descriptions when you were talking about talking with the people in your community about who's got what resources so that you can come up with what I believe you were going to recommend, a sort of a communal resource pool that we know, what assets, what skills everybody has, so we can leverage that if we need to.
Right. Yeah, you want to find out who has a medical background, who would have a guest cottage, for example, where people could be isolated who are ill.
That could become a sick room. Yeah.
Right. So they'd be converted into a sick room. Who has medical oxygen? Who would have oxygen concentrators? Who would have nebulizers? Just think through the logical chain of events. And it's really a cascade, and unfortunately, it's a real steep downhill slope. But think through all those eventualities in terms of how you structure your conversation with your neighbors. You want to find out what key resources are out there, and you also have to be very diplomatic about this and judge people. You have to be very discerning about people and figure out who's going to be willing to part with things, and who's willing to barter, who's willing to be charitable, and who you really need to just keep your distance from.
Got it. Okay, so talking about medical really quickly, on the premium side of peakprosperity.com, Chris and I wrote a piece, how we're personally preparing for the coronavirus. And in there, we have instructions on creating a sick room, on over-the-counter medications that you can get still in the pharmacy that you should have on hand. And those were not put together by Chris and I, but put together by a member of the Peak Prosperity community who is an ER doc. And so, I think our best thinking is in that piece. Do you have any resources on Survival Blog you want to point people to in terms of self-care? If you have somebody in your who gets sick?
Actually, the archives of Survival Blog date all the way back to 2005. Luckily, there's a search box, and I would recommend that people just bring up topics in that search box. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles that relate to medical topics, and it really is outside of the scope of our conversation here to try to list them all. It's a very deep, very rich set of archives. So please, folks, take full advantage of it. It's all available free of charge. You can print out whatever you want. You can save whatever you want as electronic files. Yes, I do sell an archive memory stick with a USB stick with all the blog archives, but you don't need to do that. You can actually copy individual articles to your heart's content.
Right, at least as long as the electrical utilities are up and running.
Okay, so you don't want to have the memory stick and an adapter for your iPad or your smartphone.
All right, so a couple practical questions that we get from folks a lot. At this point, I'm going to assume international air travel, you would say don't do it. Would you be that direct about it? Okay.
Absolutely.
Domestic travel.
Yeah, avoid. Okay. And also, we didn't even get a chance to talk about the economic issues here and what stocks you might want to be shorting right now. But I'm basically short on the airlines and long on the cocooning stocks, as I like to call them. Basically, any web-based business where the delivery model is electronic, things like Netflix, Amazon Prime, they're going to do wonderfully, because as this pandemic develops, the natural tendency of people is going to be to cocoon at home, and they're going to want to have things delivered, and then of course sit and watch those packages with anxious eyes after spraying them down with Lysol or whatever.
Well, let's go there for a moment.
Sure.
And I will not challenge, but toss a concern into some of your cocooning companies there. So Amazon, for example, we've had a lot of the Chinese supply chains get disrupted, and Amazon has a lot of Chinese suppliers.
It's coming out of China, but in terms of what companies are going to go under versus which are going to survive, I think Amazon's going to survive.
They will.
I would not want to be running a movie theater, a shopping mall. I certainly wouldn't want to be a cruise ship operator
right now.
those are going to absolutely crater.
Completely agree. And I wasn't trying to poke holes in your Amazon theory. My question was going to be more, so those packages arrive, right? Or let's say while you're under quarantine, the town is still allowing grocery stores to do home delivery. When you get the package on your doorstep, if you're concerned about surface contamination, what do you do?
You need it in full sunlight would be ideal. So ask the delivery person, leave it on the sunny part of the porch, and then you're going to walk out. You're going to, while you're wearing a mask and gloves and booties, you're going to spray that down with a Lysol or something stronger, preferably a povidone solution. Then with your booty, you're going to gently kick that package and roll it over, and then you're going to make sure that all 6 sides of that package get sprayed down. Then wearing gloves after a delay to let that solution take effect.
And let's be specific. How long of a delay? Minutes?
I would give it a half hour just to be safe.
Half hour, okay.
Yeah, I mean, unless time is absolutely of the essence to get into a package, give it a half hour. Then you're going to be opening that, wearing your protective gear. You're going to open that package, and then you're going to have to spray down the contents of that package, unless it's a packaged product that you have a very high confidence level was packaged before this virus ever hit the United States. So then you're going to spray down the interior, that the components within that package. And hopefully there'll be items that won't be destroyed by your spray that you're using. And then, and only then, would you feel safe using them.
Okay. So let me ask this question then. I think that works fine if you're ordering, a package from Amazon. Would you, given that you need to treat it like that, would you order a pizza? Would you order restaurant takeout?
No, I would not order anything, any prepared foods that are not packaged. Like if it's canned or retort packaged, no problem. If it's soft packaged, you probably want to spray down of course, at least spray down the exterior of that package. But even then, you'd have to worry about the integrity of that package, whether there was a hole in it that might allow contamination. So your best bet would be retort packaged foods or canned foods.
Got it. Okay. And at the point where you're self-isolating, let's say it's not a mandatory quarantine, but you're self-isolating.
Right.
At that point, if you geared up and would you even go to the grocery store and get something like fruit, or would you only be buying packaged food at that point?
I'd rather hunker down at home and grow sprouts than risk going to get fresh fruits or vegetables.
Okay.
So a sprouting kit might be a great thing for people to order right now, for example. That way you're going to have fresh greens.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. So a sprouting kit. One thing I went and got today was a bunch of frozen fruit, frozen berries, just in case my access to them gets cut off for a long period of time. I still have backup access. All right, Jim, we are over the 1 hour mark. Like I said, I could literally keep going forever on this. What haven't I asked you that you think is important for people to know before we sign off here?
Well, I'd like to leave your listeners with one important thing is proceed with prayer. I think it's important that even if you're a person who's a backslidden faithful person, it's time to get down on your knees, pray, ask for God's guidance, providence, and protection, because at this point, we're going to need it.
I think that's well said. We talk a lot about the importance of community and the importance of emotional resilience. And I think you're tapping into that, on the spiritual side there. All throughout human history and human civilization, humans have gone through trying times, and what carry us through those times oftentimes is belief or faith that tomorrow, is going to be better and that we're going to make it through it, and that we're all in it together. I know you mentioned personal protection, sort of in the vein of home security. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, at least in today's discussion. But if I can interpret the spirit of what you just said, remember that we're all in this together. Remember, in the spirit of brotherhood, we're gonna get through this much better than if we turn on one another. So let's be good stewards, good caretakers of ourselves, but each other as well.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much, Adam. And I pray the 91st Psalm for you and all your listeners.
Well, thank you, Jim. Appreciate that very much. Again, I appreciate you sharing all your expertise with us, coming on at such short notice upon our request. And I'm sure we're going to get lots of questions to this podcast, which we will share with you. And please feel free to give it access to the Survival Blog folks as well. But I'm going to guess that we may have a lot of requests to have you back on. So at some point, if you're free, we'd love to do that.
I'd certainly enjoy doing so. Thank you.
Fantastic, Jim. All right. Well, stay safe, my friend.
You too.
Bye-bye.